Welcome to Trinity Radio. You're on the Christian channel that loves atheists, and I'm Braxton Hunter. And I've got a confession to make. I'm experiencing what I think most YouTubers probably experience every now and then, and that's a little bit of a creative block or writer's block. There's nothing right now at the moment that I just have to get out or that I really think God wants me to say, and I don't believe in kind of just drumming something up. But I do always have a few things on the back burner that I want to get to at some point. And this is a great opportunity to get to at least one of those. And that is my personal experience with Christianity, my personal testimony. Now, don't go away if you think this is going to be boring. It might be. But it might also be helpful in understanding something of the Christian faith, something of Christian doctrine or the Christian experience lived out over about 4 decades. And it also is a good opportunity for me to give myself some space to say some things that I never really get to say in other videos. Often whenever details about my Christian upbringing or my Christian evangelical school experience or things like that, when those come up, they just come up, in passing. Someone might on another show ask me to talk about my salvation experience, or someone may ask a question in a Q&A that means I need to go back and talk about something that I experienced in my past. But I've never really just given my testimony that I can remember on this channel. And especially for those of you who have become subscribers or even patrons and are financially supporting what we're doing, I think you have a right to know who you're listening to. And so I'm going to share my Christian experience with you. I don't want to just say my testimony, although it certainly is that, if by testimony we mean the entirety of my Christian experience. But a lot of times when people say, I'm going to share with you my testimony, they just mean their salvation experience. And this is going to be more than that. So here goes. I was born the son of a megachurch pastor. My father was the pastor of a large church in Jacksonville, Florida. And at that time, the idea of a megachurch was a relatively new thing. There were some megachurches, but there weren't a lot of them. And whatever you want to say about what was good or bad about the idea or the phenomenon of megachurches, my father pastored one. And so I grew up in that context. In fact, I remember when we moved from the church building, that had traditional looking church building that we had been in for the first few years of my life, to this massive sanctuary and gymnasium and complex with educational space near the Jacksonville Zoo on the north side of Jacksonville. And it was exciting. It was new. It was fresh. It looked like we were going somewhere, and we were. And many people were coming to Christ through my father's preaching, and many people were growing in their faith. And as a child, I had every reason to be proud of who my father was and what God was doing through his life. I enjoyed my experience as a pastor's kid. I enjoyed specifically being the pastor's kid that I was with the pastor father that I had. And I don't want to put emphasis on my father to the exclusion of my mother. Both of my parents, I just feel like I won the lottery with my parents. I mean, they are both incredible human beings, incredible ambassadors for Christ, and raised me, I think, the way that God would want me raised. So anything that's gone wrong in my life, any mistakes I've made, that's on me. But they did an incredible job. In fact, I've often said, and obviously I'm being hyperbolic here, but there's some truth in it. If I get to heaven one day and I realize that, or God tells me, hey, actually, there were 2 other perfect people besides Jesus, and it's your parents, I wouldn't be too surprised. But that was my experience growing up as a pastor's kid. I went to a Christian school that my father started that was at our church. And at the most the church had, I think it's an auditorium that seated 5,000, or no, the auditorium seated 3,500, and the membership of the church was 5,000. So that gives you some idea of the context and size. Now, I have a brother who's adopted, and his experience is going to differ from mine. He was 10 years older than me. And so, I don't know what he would say exactly about that experience, but I absolutely loved it. Because of the size of the church, and in a time when churches weren't really typically that big, some of the movers and shakers of the city went to our church. And so what my father preached could theoretically have impact on things in the city. And Jacksonville is a relatively big city. And so He was on the he was on the television at night, about 8 o'clock, I think, on Sunday nights. So he had an impact in the town. And he was a controversial, straightforward preacher. And so there were things that happened during our upbringing. Like I remember police having to, escort us home one night after church. I remember my father having to wear a bulletproof vest into the pulpit. There were things like that happened. What would I think about that if I were older and experiencing that? What sort of fears would I have? As a kid who was probably at that time about 8 years old, 8 or 9, I thought it was cool. I thought it was exciting. I thought it was, an adventure. But I really loved that experience. I really, really loved that experience growing up that way. At 5 years old, I knelt on the brown shag carpet of the pastorum, which is the flowery term for the house that the church provides for the pastor and his family to live in. And I knelt in that brown shag carpet and prayed to receive Christ. I came to my father one morning and I said, Dad, I know that I'm a sinner. I know what sin is. I know that Jesus died for my sins, and I want to be one of his followers for the rest of my life. And some of my atheist friends would say, you were clearly indoctrinated. Yes. And we all indoctrinate our children with certain things. And I consider myself a better person for having been indoctrinated with the truth of Christianity. I prayed to receive Christ and was baptized even that morning. Now, about a year later, in Vacation Bible School, I'll never forget it, I already began to experience doubts. Not doubts about the truth of Christianity, but doubts about my personal salvation. This is something that I think most Christians experience to one degree or another. Hopefully, most of us get past that worry about doubting our salvation. For me, getting past it was relatively easy because that year, when I was 6 years old at Vacation Bible School, we had a children's pastor, Brother Alvin. Brother Alvin is one of the most important influences on my life, one of the most wonderful human beings I've ever met. Brother Alvin always wore a Alvin and the Chipmunks pendant on his tie, and so that the kids could remember his name. He did balloon animals. He did Bible stories in a creative way using an old school 1980s felt board. Of course, at the time it wasn't old school. It was the 1980s. And Brother Alvin caught me in Vacation Bible School, and I said to him, Brother Alvin, I don't know that I'm really saved. I'm worried that I don't really know Jesus. And he said to me, Braxton, does the Bible seem to teach that if you repent of your sins and trust Jesus, that he'll save you? And I said, well, yeah, everybody knows that. And he said, okay, did you do that? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, does Jesus lie? And I said, no. And he said, well, if Jesus said that's what you need to make sure is true about you, and you did, and Jesus said if you did that, you'd be saved, then it doesn't make too much sense to worry about your salvation then, does it? Because that would be calling Jesus a liar. That hit me like a ton of bricks. And that day, as some have said, it was like I put a stake in the ground, a flag on the moon, and I said, from this point forward, I can always look back to this moment and know that I dealt with it. Now, unfortunately, that wasn't exactly the end of it, but it was pretty well the end of it. A few years went by, and when I was 10 years old, we moved to Nashville, Tennessee. And my father went into full-time evangelistic ministry, traveling and preaching in churches all around America and sometimes outside of the country. He was usually gone, leaving on a Saturday and come back on a Wednesday night or Thursday morning. And so, but I never felt like I had an absentee father. The good thing about this experience was, unlike most people whose parents work a regular job or pastors' families, when my dad was home, he was completely home. He was completely there for us, and he was all ours. So there wasn't any concern that he would have to run out to finish something at the office or anything like that. So I really felt like he was there for me throughout my childhood. But my mother deserves a Medal of Honor for keeping everything together when my father was gone. So at this point in my life, when my father had gone into evangelism, traveling and preaching, sometimes we would go with him. And I remember going with him one of the first revivals, we called them, that he went to preach. And during one of those services, so I was 10 or 11 years old here. During one of those services, my father was preaching, and I really just became overwhelmed with concern that I began doubting my salvation. And, you know, when you come to Christ at, say, 5 or 6 years old, which I do believe can genuinely happen, though I believe that needs to be dealt with very, very carefully, and I think my parents did. But when you come to Christ that early, there is a concern that there's something that can happen. You know, later on, at that young age, you haven't really gotten a lot of good sinning under your belt. I mean, we're all sinners, but I hadn't, and I knew what was right and wrong, and I did wrong things. But I hadn't done, you know, certain things that I might consider, from my perspective at the time, really bad things. And so, I mean, I wasn't like a serial killer at 11 years old, so don't get me wrong, but you can understand an 11-year-old is starting to experience things. And, you know, he might do things that he sees are new, sinful things he hadn't done before. And so you know, lying to your parents, you know, not doing your homework and lying to your parents, these seem like big deals in my household at my age. And so I remember feeling really convicted that maybe I'm not really saved. Well, at this particular church in North Carolina that we were at, it was one of the operations where, like, the sanctuary, people that grew up in like Southern Baptist churches in the South will know what I'm talking about, but it was like a sanctuary, and underneath the sanctuary, the whole length of the sanctuary, was the fellowship hall for the church. And at the end of that underground fellowship hall was a makeshift hotel room that the church had put together for when they had visiting preachers come. And so our family was staying in that room. So I felt free to leave the sanctuary during the service while my dad was preaching, went downstairs, and I'll never forget, in that fellowship hall, leaning against one of the supports that held up the sanctuary and saying to the Lord, Lord, I don't know whether or not what happened to me when I was 5 years old was real. But I know that what I'm experiencing right now is real. I know that I understand everything right now. And I know that right now, the best I can, I'm turning everything over to you. I want to commit my life to you for the rest of my life. I know I'm a sinner. I repent of my sins. I turn from my sins. I know I'm going to make mistakes going forward, but it's not my intention to make those mistakes going forward. And I'm committing my life to serving you. Whatever had not been resolved by that point in my life was resolved there that night. And it was like a ton of bricks coming off my shoulders, like everybody says. So that was a very influential moment in my life, and I'll never forget that. When I got to when we were living in Nashville, I continued in Christian school. I was in public school for a little while, but then I was in Christian school for most of my upbringing, and I really enjoyed the experience. I mean, there are certain things that happen when you're in middle school and high school that nobody experiences. There's awkwardness there. What lunch table do I sit at? Am I am I friends with this person? Or they, all these kind of thoughts that you have. What about dating? What about girls? This whole thing. So that was there. Those things that we are glad to leave in the past were there for sure. But in general, I'm glad for my Christian school upbringing. It did reinforce to me. It reinforced to me throughout my upbringing that the dedication I needed to show toward the Lord. And I want to say something about this here because this is a pretty important moment. I see videos from atheists who will say, just recently from Genetically Modified Skeptic, he says things like, it seems like in Christian college they had to have these prayer things and these Bible studies and devotionals all the time in chapel because they've got to just really try to convince you anew all the time to maintain that belief and all those kind of things. I can't speak to his experience, but I can tell you that was not my experience, nor the experience of my friends. And we always talked pretty openly about these things. The reason that Christian schools and Christian colleges have those kinds of things in place is not necessarily to try and convince you anew every day of the truth of Christianity, but rather it's to help you facilitate a more dedicated and deeper walk with the Lord. Now, you can call that indoctrination, and on some not malicious definition of the term indoctrination, yeah, we were receiving doctrine, but we wanted it. We believed that Christianity was true. And the people teaching it to us were not trying to pull the wool over their eyes. They believed that Christianity was true. So this was something we were willingly participating in and our parents were aware of and something we wanted. And again, it wasn't to convince us that it was true. I mean, I'm not saying there weren't like apologetic moments here and there, but I don't remember any. It was about helping us to live the Christian life the way that young Christian kids want to live the Christian life. And so I enjoyed that experience. I loved it. Met some friends there that I'm still friends with, even to this day. Two friends that I went to school with there live in the town that I live in now in Evansville. And both of them have worked here at Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary, and one still does, because that friendship was those friendships were lifelong friendships. And they have the same sort of an explanation of their Christian school upbringing as I did. But it was during this time that some really important things began to happen. First of all, as I said, I revisited my salvation and got that all sorted out. But during this period of time, I developed a real love for music. Now, this may seem unimportant at the moment, and perhaps it is unimportant. My brother Chad had been the one who had the vast music collection. He had all of the cassettes, and then he had all of the CDs. And, he was the one who was into that sort of thing. He's a graphic design artist. He was into design. He was into the entertainment stuff, movies, music, all that. That was all Chad's stuff. And I think my parents had kind of this understanding that I wasn't really going to go that way. But I was influenced not just by my parents, but also by my brother. And looking back, I think my parents and I would both say that was a wonderful thing. That was a good thing, because it added a lot of creativity into who I am and the way I think. And so during this process, I got into music. I'll never forget going to Hickory Hollow Mall in Nashville, Tennessee, and buying a cassette tape of MC Hammer's Too Legit to Quit with some money that I'd gotten for Christmas. And in the car, my father specifically, was bothered by this, because I remember him specifically saying, music is Chad's thing. Why are you getting into music? Why are you buying? And my parents never forced us to only listen to Christian music. My parents were pretty, open about that sort of thing. They weren't legalists, but they did prefer that if I listened to music, it would be Christian music. And trust me, I had a lot of DC Talk, Audio Adrenaline, Skillet, all these bands, Third Day. I remember very clearly, and this tells me about my spirituality at that time in my life. I remember listening to Thief by Third Day and crying. I mean, just bawling my eyes out in my bedroom. And it's still a powerful song. If you haven't heard it, you should. But I got MC Hammer, and then I got Ace of Base. Okay, now don't judge the musical choices of an adolescent too strongly, okay? But I had MC Hammer and Ace of Base. This became important later, because music became something that I thought I was going to build my life and career around. I got into U2, and when I found U2, it was like my eyes had been opened, because here was a band that were outspoken Christians, at least 3 of the 4 members, but they weren't technically a Christian band. You couldn't get them at the Christian bookstore, couldn't get them at Lifeway. And their stage performance was powerful. I mean, they just connected with their audience. And I just always thought that was incredible. So I picked up the guitar and I started learning to play the guitar, although I have to say at this point, it was probably to impress girls more than it was about anything to do with God. But I loved music, and then started taking guitar lessons. At some point during my teenage experience, I think it was when I was 16 years old, I went on a mission trip to Michigan and Grand Rapids. And the mission trip was all built around building a baseball field, clearing off this land so they could build a baseball field for this small church that wanted to have a ministry to young people. And so we were there at this church and doing VBS for the kids in the community while we were there. And so we did that. And on the last night that we were there, my youth group, and I was really tight with my youth group. My youth group was in this little chapel of this church, arguing with each other, mad at each other about, of all things, how we were going to present, like what sort of a production will we put on at church back home to present how God had done all these incredible spiritual things on this mission trip. I mean, people were arguing and in disagreement about how to express all these incredibly mind-blowing spiritual things, and how we'd all become so mature on this mission trip. And we're arguing about that. I am not saying this so that you'll think I'm so great, but I was not a part of that argument. I was in a different argument, an argument with God of sorts, sitting on the front row of that little church with all of that happening behind me in the pews. I was sitting there thinking about what I think God wanted me to do with my life. I had plans to go into the music business. I wanted to be Bono, and so that was my real passion at the time. But I also loved Jesus. I really loved church, and I didn't want to give up that part, and of course never planned to. At some point, our youth pastor, J.D. Davis, also a huge impact in my life, was sick of dealing with this rowdy youth group, frankly, and told everyone, just shut up and bow your heads and pray. And then he said, I don't even care if you pray, just bow your heads and shut up. And so we did. Again, I'm sitting on the front row, and I'm on the inside of the pew, like closest to the center aisle of this church on the left-hand side. And I'm praying, and I say to God, I can already hear atheists online joking about this, but I said, God, I don't know exactly whether what I'm feeling right now is real or not. And you know what I ultimately want. I want to have a business in music. But I feel like you're leading me toward ministry of some sort and not music-related ministry, some kind of a preaching and teaching ministry. And if that's it, God, you're going to have to make it really clear for me, because it's not what I want. I don't want to do that. This may not be the most inspirational testimony to those of you who are out there and thinking maybe God is leading you into some kind of ministry, but I said, I don't want that. Let me be clear. I want to be a musician. I want to be Bono. I don't know if I said that in prayer, but he knew. But I said, if that's what you want, I'll do it, but you've got to make it incredibly clear. At that moment, I opened my eyes and looked up, and right in front of me, is this what you want me to do, God? Is this what you want me to do? Right in front of me, on the front of the communion table that most churches have, most churches of this sort, it said, "This do in remembrance of me." Most of them say that. And of course, I knew that most of them said that, but I wasn't thinking about it. I just knew I was sitting on a pew in this church, asking God to make it clear to me. I looked up, and there it was. To me, that settled it. Coincidence, perhaps, but I don't think so. And one of the reasons that I'm so certain that God wanted me to do this particular kind of ministry is because it's not what I wanted. Some ministers say they just look at a pulpit and they just salivate because they want to preach. Not me. I've never wanted to preach. I mean, there may have been isolated moments where I was really excited about something that I believed God had laid on my heart to say to a congregation. And so I was excited in that moment. And there have certainly been times while preaching where I enjoyed exercising the gifts that I think God gave me. But at the beginning, I did not want to do it. And many times since then, I've not wanted to do it. And so this gives me some measure of confirmation. So I got up and I went to my youth pastor and I said, I'm not happy about this, but God has called me into the gospel ministry. We sat at what was the equivalent of a Denny's. It might have been a Denny's attached to our hotel room till about 1 o'clock that morning, talking about this and talking about all the implications of it and what it might mean and all those kind of things. And of course, it happened. I did go into the gospel ministry. But my parents, I think my parents were glad to hear this, but they didn't show it. I came home and I told my father, Dad, I think that God wants me to be in the gospel ministry. I think I'm called to be a preacher. And I'll never forget him saying, huh, and not showing any real excitement about it. And then encouraging me later on to go to school for music. In fact, I did begin a program at Middle Tennessee State University in music business, because I did ultimately realize that I'm never going to be Bono, but I can make money off of other people that might be Bono. And so I decided to go into music business and took several courses there in that. But the reason I think my father encouraged that and didn't show overwhelming excitement at the idea that I was called to the gospel ministry was because he didn't want me to be doing it just to please him. I think that was what it was about. He wanted, if it was real, he wanted it to be real. And he didn't want it to be just something I was doing because I thought that's what he wanted. And looking back, that's meaningful. So I went to, although it could have saved him a lot of money if I hadn't gone to Middle Tennessee State, but there was a reason to go to Middle Tennessee State, and that's an important thing. There, I met my wife, and I was looking across at her one day in the KUC, the student center there at Middle Tennessee State. And what initially attracted to me to her, was it love at first sight? No. I don't believe in love at first sight. Now, maybe it's real, but I think we've got a word for that. I think love at first sight could be better described as physical attraction or possibly lust. But it was certainly physical attraction. She was hot. So I went over there and I sat next to her, and we began to talk. And I had pretty simple, basic requirements for someone that I was going to date. Number one, they couldn't be a smoker. Number two, they had to be female. And three, they had to be breathing. That was about it. I didn't have that many standards. Sarah surpassed them all. But one of my requirements was that they be a Christian, because I don't believe in what has been termed missionary dating. It has worked out. In fact, in this story, you're going to hear an interesting story on that, or an interesting take on that. But I didn't believe in that. I believed that Christians should date other Christians, because it's a lot easier to continue your devotion to Christ and continue your Christian living if you date someone who's a Christian. Now, there are atheists out there who may be tempted to think, because if you date a non-Christian, it might drag you into unbelief. Well, that certainly could be the case, I guess, but that's not really... You can't look at everything in terms of believing it's true or not believing it's true. Even for many people that walk away from the church or walk away from Christianity, however you want to frame that up, they still basically believe it's true or is probably true. They're just not committed to it anymore. Or they're not, it's not always about belief. And that's the important thing to mention, I think. But so I wanted to date Sarah, and so we started dating. And it was great. And she was a part of what sounded like a harmless, non-denominational church in our city, in Nashville. And she had what sounded like a normal gospel testimony. But as we talked more, I realized that someone at that church was trying to prevent her from dating me. Not prevent her from dating, but prevent her from dating me. And why? Because I wasn't a member of that particular church. Long story short, this particular group in Nashville turned out to be a bona fide cult in the truest sense of the word. In fact, there's a 60 Minutes episode about it because they had churches in multiple cities. And it involved having what they call a discipler. If I have a male friend, let's say I'm a single guy and I've got a male friend, and we decide we want to room together, his discipler has to get with my discipler, and they decide about whether it makes sense for us to room together. Adult, men who are over 18. If you want to date someone, you got to run that past your discipler, and you confess your sins to your discipler. And you receive a book of secret knowledge several years after you become a member of the church. And of course, in the earlier days of the internet, I just ordered it off eBay. Simple as can be. I was told, you can't get a copy of this. Well, eBay, people had it. And it was shocking. And so my wife didn't know a lot of that stuff about it. We learned this together, some of it. But it did turn out that this church was problematic. And while we were dating, she visited with me a place where my dad was preaching in Owensboro, Kentucky, not too far from where I'm at right now. And we traveled up there and we visited. And several weeks later, she told me that she had become a Christian on that night. And one of the strongest apologetics, personally, I'm not asking you to believe on the basis of this, but something that I certainly experienced to some degree, because I know what this is like. I know what the conviction of the Holy Spirit is like and how it differs from simply guilt. And it doesn't have to do with how I was wired to think. But this is a great apologetic. She said to me, before that night, when I would do bad things, I knew it was wrong, and I did feel guilty. But now, when I do some things that I know don't please God, it is deeply convicting. It's the conviction of the Holy Spirit. That's an entirely different experience. It's powerful. And that difference is really meaningful. And I think is an evidence toward, maybe not an evidence that compels you to believe, but it's an evidence of the work of the Holy Spirit in someone's life. So anyway, we went through that, and then so I didn't intend to do missionary dating, but indirectly, I guess I did. And but you see, that laid the groundwork for me getting into apologetics, because during that period, as I was listening to what was coming out of her church and reading about it, I was researching how to respond to this stuff, how to respond to people that had false doctrine and were marring the gospel message and twisting it. And that in some ways is the most important type of apologetics, because that kind of deception has elements of truth in it. And so it's very important. I don't even know that I had a strong awareness of apologetics at the time, but that was there. Around the same time, one of my best friends from high school started to experience, or had already been experiencing, same-sex attraction. Now, this is not going to be about that. I've got a video on that subject that you can search. But I had a friend who was experiencing same-sex attraction, but yet he had been like a strong conservative Christian. He was an evangelical conservative Christian and politically conservative, and from a politically conservative family in a politically conservative place, Lebanon, Tennessee. And I don't know how red or blue Lebanon, Tennessee is, but everything they sell at Cracker Barrel and Lifeway Christian bookstores goes through warehouses in Lebanon, Tennessee, outside of Nashville. I mean, he went to a conservative Christian school, went to a conservative Southern Baptist church. I mean, this guy, and he believed all of it. And, but yet he began to experience and really struggle with same-sex attraction. And for a long time, he tried to ignore it. But when he went to college, it kind of became more, he realized he couldn't really ignore it. He had to make some decisions about it, about how to, I'm not talking about whether someone decides to have homosexual feelings. That's not what I'm talking about. He had to make a decision about how to function within his conservative Christian paradigm with same-sex attraction. For a while, he decided maybe I can look at the Bible and reinterpret it, and maybe it doesn't teach about same-sex attraction what I thought it did. But he realized that he couldn't honestly take it seriously. To him it was clear that the Bible was not approving of this. You can go to Romans chapter 1, you can go to 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 9 through 11, and you can see that it's not just it's not just the nature of or the context of the relationships. It was the very acts themselves. And so whatever you want to say about that or think about that, he was wrestling with that. Then he moved on to a position that was, hey, maybe the Bible is kind of, Jesus is not everyone's way, but he's my way, and you can take what you want and leave the rest from the Bible, kind of a cafeteria-style Christianity. But he realized that was kind of disingenuous and that didn't really flow with historic Christianity. And so at some point he realized, I've got to make a decision between whether or not I'm going to have a biblical Christian lifestyle, or I'm going to go away from the Bible and have a gay lifestyle. And that's what he did. And this actually led to a degradation in his faith over a few years, to the point that he affirms atheism now. Now, he began to antagonize my faith at that point, and not in it was obnoxious, but not in like a real rigorous way. But the challenges were there, and it rattled me. It didn't rattle me in the sense that I was experiencing doubt about the truth of Christianity, but it rattled me in the sense that I wanted to be able to give him an answer that I didn't know how to give. I wanted to be able to say something that I didn't know how to say. And so this led me to take a further look at the reasons to believe that Christianity was true. And in fact, I didn't become an apologist that moment, but I began to deconstruct, And so I thought, okay, I'm confident of Christianity, but I'm going to take apart everything that I say I believe doctrinally and everything else and put it back together and see if it holds water. Now pause there for a second, because that's happening simultaneously to something else that was going on in my life. Right after about the time I got married, I had already been a youth pastor at one church, and now I was a youth pastor at another church. And I was 20 years old at this time. And at that time, my wife and I got married, and I'd been a youth pastor for a while, and a possibility opened up for me to be what they call a senior pastor of a Southern Baptist church. Now, I was probably too young to pastor anything, and there are some things I did wrong, but I don't think I really hurt anybody. So that's good. But I moved to Florida, and I began pastoring a church there. It was a small church. It was one of those churches that had been a large congregation at one time, but the side of town where all the rich people used to live had kind of gone downhill, and there were a few people hanging on still. And that was a great opportunity for me to learn some things, and to learn to put sermons together, and learn to look at the commentaries and study deeper and all those kind of things. And so I did. It was a really stressful time in my life as I looked back. I've just gotten married, and now I'm putting together 3 messages a week, and I don't really know what I'm doing. Fortunately, my father was able to give me great advice and kind of help me along, and he was there for me to pass things by. And after a couple of years, I moved from there and went to pastor the second church in a small town outside of Murfreesboro, Tennessee, above Chattanooga, McMinnville, Tennessee. And so I went there, and that church grew over 3 years from about 225 in regular attendance to over 600 in regular attendance. God really blessed there. And it was really exciting. We went to 2 services, and it was during that time that I got a lot of the antagonism from my friend from high school who is now gay. And so I deconstructed while I was pastoring. Now, I still believed the Christian message, and so I wasn't being disingenuous in the pulpit. I don't have one of those kind of testimonies where I was an atheist for a while, but I did deconstruct and put everything back together, beginning at that point. And some things changed, but that got me into the world of apologetics. It was also during that time that every summer I would go through a series in June on false beliefs that were in our community. So I would talk about theologically liberal churches. I would talk about the Mormons in the community, the Jehovah's Witnesses, things like this. And so I got my feet wet with some apologetics there. And I began. I skipped something that was really important. During this time, I had left, obviously, before we went to Florida, before I started pastoring. I left Middle Tennessee State University. You can tell this is really off the cuff. I left Middle Tennessee State University and gone to seminary because an atheist academic advisor noticed that I was trying to schedule as many philosophy and religion courses into my program as I could. And she asked me why. And I said, well, it's because ultimately I want to be in ministry. And she said, let me ask you a question. If you want to be in ministry and not in music business, why don't you just go to seminary or Bible college and then seminary? And I said, you know something, you're absolutely right. And that's what I did. And so that catches you up there. So at this point now, while I'm pastoring my second church, toward the end of that, I started looking deeper into reasons to believe. And as an entry point, I was a young earth creationist. And so who did I find? I found Ken Ham and Kent Hovind. And man, did I eat up their material. I mean, I was drinking it in. MP3 players had come out by that point. And I would download stuff from Sermon Audio and other places where I could get their lectures. And then I would listen to them while I was working out. And I listened to each of those things multiple times. I loved it. And about the time I left pastoring, I had also read Case for Christ, Case for Faith, Case for a Creator, those kind of things. About the time I left pastoring and went into full-time traveling, speaking at different churches and things like that, because I really felt a heart. I recognized a pastor needs to be interested in seeing people come to Christ, but he also needs to be interested in helping them grow in their relationship with Christ and discipling them. It's what we call discipleship. And I was doing both of those things, and I think I was doing them okay, but I really felt drawn to evangelism. And I was starting to see how apologetics could augment your evangelism or be a part of your evangelism. Because you're going to run into people that don't believe, right? So what are you going to say? And so I left there, and somewhere around that time, Ken Ham was talking about, and I don't think he said the word heretic, but that was the impression that I got. These heretics who don't affirm young earth creationism like William Lane Craig and Norman Geisler, and named them. And I thought, well, I want to know who these liberals are because I need to know what these false teachers are saying. This is weird to say because like I'm talking about heroes of mine now. So I bought Reasonable Faith. I bought Norman Geisler's Systematic Theology and some other stuff from him. And I began to read. And I thought, man, these heretics seem to know what they're talking about. And about this, somewhere in all of this, Anthony Fleur's book, There Is a God came out. Francis Collins' book, The Language of God came out. The atheist books came out, God's Not Great by Hitchens, and The End of Faith, Sam Harris, and The God Delusion, Dawkins, and and all these things were floating around in my mind at the same time. I read all these books. I was getting everything I could through audio and video on the internet. Fortunately, video debates on the internet were popping up like crazy, and so I was like, I think the first generation to really learn apologetics that way too, along with reading books. And at some point, during this deconstruction and assessing all these things, I had to face, okay, well, what do I really believe about creation? And most of what I put back together in my faith stayed the same. There were some minor changes that aren't relevant to get into in this video. But one of the things that changed that doesn't seem like a big deal to some of you, but was definitely a big deal in my family because my father was a young earth creationist. And I've been raised to believe young earth creationism. And it was just a part of the biblical message as I had taken it in. There are many atheists out there for whom it is a part of the message they were taught, almost to the point of their believing that it was synonymous with the gospel message. So that when they felt like young earth creationism fell away, then that was a fast track toward other things quickly peeling off that left them outside of the faith. And I think that is silly. It doesn't need to happen. It's short-sighted, and it didn't happen with me. Young earth creationism fell away from me, but that doesn't mean the authority of the Bible fell away, or inerrancy fell away, or Genesis fell away. None of that happened. The Bible nowhere intends to teach the age of the church, the age of the earth, or the age of the universe, and it's important that we recognize that. Now, I realize that I've got a lot of listeners who are young earth creationists. I totally get that, and I'm not preaching at you. I don't care what you believe about the age of the earth, and it's not a big part of what I do. The reason I'm talking about it now is not to belittle people who are young earth creationism, who are my brothers and sisters. It's to raise something that changed, that took a long time for me to let go of, and then to be open about and to be honest about. And when I was, it did lead to some lengthy discussions with other Christian friends, pastors, and my own father. But fortunately, my father actually wasn't as big as a deal as I thought it would be. But I thought it was going to be a big deal. I don't know what it's like to deconvert from Christianity, and I hope to God I never do. But I do know what it's like to let go of a cherished belief that you have, in my case, had thundered from the pulpit was the truth, and then come off of it and have to be open about that. And one thing that I can tell you is that it's liberating in a sense. There's something pleasurable about it. Maybe not for everyone, but there was for me. That I could do that. Not arrogant. That's going to be another point in a second. But there was something about it that I had a capacity to do something that I never thought I would do and that I didn't think I could do. And I let go of that. And so that was pleasurable in a sense. And yes, it can lead to an arrogance or a pride about it. An arrogance and a pride that you were able to do something that other Christians probably aren't able to do. Other Christians might not need to do, but you did. And that is pleasurable. It can develop a sense of pride. And if you're a Christian or an atheist out there, that can become, because it's pleasurable and because it can create a sense of pride in you, it can create the desire to see if you can do it with more things, or if you need to do it with more things. And so you begin looking at other doctrines. And there are other things. I'll talk about one in a moment. But I think, I know some people on Facebook who are Christians, who are my brothers and sisters in Christ, who once that first doctrinal position fell, they changed a lot of doctrinal things. There's a student of ours, David Paulman, who I think it was him, that created a graph that showed 8 or 12 things that he shifted positions on. And when I look at that, and by the way, I know people who are in their 60s who shift those positions. And what it does to me is when I see atheists say, oh, you're saying you just don't think we understand Christianity. Trust me. I was in church. I was raised in church. I understand Christianity. I just don't buy it. I believe you believe that. And I don't want to be condescending. No, this is going to sound a little condescending, but it's true. There are people who have been looking in a sophisticated and detailed way at their faith and at the doctrines of their faith for decades and have shifted on a number of things without ditching the whole thing. Okay. You haven't looked at every aspect of every view, right? Nor should you necessarily be expected to. But the point is, I think sometimes one thing falls away and then a bunch of other stuff falls away pretty darn quick. And you can watch the deconversion testimonies to see that. When that's jumping over, that's skipping a lot of steps, right? The idea that you understand Christianity perfectly fine and you reject it, when there are people, academics, who have studied this for decades and haven't done that. Come on, I'm not buying it. I get that you buy it. I don't believe you're being dishonest. Think more deeply about it, I guess would be the thing. And one of the things that leads to that is when you point to extremely fundamentalist understandings of Christianity, and not everyone does this. If the shoe doesn't fit, don't wear it. And you reject that, and that to you is Christianity. Or you're aware of a couple of views when there are multiple views, right? Every time I hear somebody say something like, Jesus was wrong in his predictions about when he was going to return. Jesus was wrong about the coming of the kingdom. All these kind of things. Or, they only understand one aspect, or one take on end times, or one take on creation, or one take on hell. And I think, no, you don't. That's not... okay, I'm not going to preach about that, but that's an important point. Is that there's it's a lifetime journey of tweaking and inspecting and making sure you have it right. You don't just skip over all those steps to, well, this young Earth creationism is false, so I guess Christianity is false. No, that's silly. But I got into, now at this point I'd moved to Nashville again. And I'd gone into full-time traveling and preaching at churches. And this is one of the times in my life where I am most certain that I was not in God's will. That'd be the nice thing about being a Calvinist, is whatever I end up doing in some sense was God's determination for my life. But as a non-Calvinist, I don't believe God is determining everything that I do, and I was out of God's will. Because for reasons that aren't important to this, I knew that our family was supposed to leave the place where I was pastoring in McMinnville, Tennessee, and I was going to go into traveling ministry like I did, but I was to move to Evansville, Indiana, where I live right now. I knew as much as I can know anything about what I think God wants for me, and I think I can know things, I believe I knew that. And it was the wrong decision. And I knew it was wrong. Now, I had lied to myself, and there was all kinds of reasons like, hey, Nashville has got to be the place because that's where all the interstates come together in Nashville. It makes a lot of sense. I grew up here. This is home, you know. There's a lot of churches in Nashville that might have me come speak. You know, it made a lot of sense. Evansville, Indiana, there's not even an interstate, right? So what? That didn't make any sense. But I knew it. And I got out of God's will and moved to Nashville. And I have to say that my life, our family, suffered greatly. I suffered in my marriage. I suffered financially. I suffered in a lot of ways. In fact, we had a condo in Nashville that we lived in when we were there that I just sold like a few months ago. And that's been 12 years ago that we left there. But you know, we couldn't sell it because we moved out in 2008, and that's when the economy crashed and we couldn't sell it. So I suffered in a lot of ways there. And when I finally got things in gear and recognized, God, enough, I will do what I know you wanted me to do, we moved to Evansville, Indiana. And so that was a very interesting point in my life. But while living in Nashville, my apologetics interest just flourished. I mean, I read everything. I studied everything. And it was at that time where I was kind of trying to take things apart and put it back together. The resurrection case, if I'm completely honest, and even now, I think the Kalam cosmological argument and contingency arguments, but particularly for me, the Kalam. I don't need to hear all your comments in the comments section about this, okay? I just don't need to hear it. I've heard it all 1,000 times, okay? I know your take. But to me, that was so powerful for God's existence, to the point that the idea that God didn't exist to me was laughable, okay? But the resurrection case, even now, I don't think is as strong as the Kalam. The resurrection case is not as strong for the resurrection as the Kalam is for God's existence. Now, I know that I can think already of the atheists that are going to clip this out. So I'm aware that's going to happen. But the resurrection case is darn strong, in my opinion. Strong enough, strong as it needs to be, stronger than it needs to be. And it's certainly enough. But at that point, I was trying to work through it. And I knew who Mike Licona was. I'd watched some of his debates. Early stuff. I mean, he and Gary Habermas went on a show called The Infidel Guy long time ago. Reginald Finney, maybe some of y'all remember that. Finley. And I, at this point in my life, I was still what we call an evangelist. I was traveling, speaking in regular evangelism at different churches. And I was a Southern Baptist, and I became the youngest ever president of the Conference of Southern Baptist Evangelists, which has the worst acronym of anything ever. It's COSB. COSB, the Conference of Southern Baptist Evangelists. And I became the youngest ever president of that organization. And this really helped me to prepare for later becoming the president of a Bible college and seminary, because it taught me, I'd been a pastor, but now this taught me further organizational skills on a much larger national level. Well, the Conference of Southern Baptist Evangelists is a denominationally endorsed arm of the Southern Baptist Convention under the auspices of the North American Mission Board, NAM. The Southern Baptist Convention has the North American Mission Board and the International Mission Board. NAM is for the doing evangelism and ministry within the U.S., and the IMB is for outside the U.S. So I was the head of a Southern Baptist entity under NAM. And NAM cut our funding for the first time in 30-something years. Cut the funding for Conference of Southern Baptist Evangelists. I had to navigate that whole thing, and it was really something. But that was really good and helpful for me, and because of it, I got to go to a lot of conferences. Guess who was working for the North American Mission Board at the time? Mike Licona. And Mike Licona will always be special to me because when I got to one of these conferences, I saw him. I had just been listening to a debate of his in the car on the way to this conference, had no idea he was going to be there. And I said, "You're Mike Licona." He said, "Yes, I am." I said, oh my gosh, I was just listening to you in the car. I love your ministry. I began to talk to him. And he said, well, let's go chat. And Mike Licona sat with me, a nobody, as far as he was concerned. And he sat with me for 3 hours and just talked. Just talking apologetics, talking shop, talking about ministry, talking about the Bible. And that relationship, that friendship exists to this day. We've been around the world together. I'll never forget driving around in Sarasota together in a rental car and hanging out at the beach and going to restaurants and doing all kinds of cool things together. And we've done that many, many times. I consider him a close personal friend, and he's coached me for debates and things like that. I talk to him all the time. Love Mike. Because he showed a young apologist attention when there was no benefit to him to do so, just because he loves Jesus and just because he loves people. So that's one of the reasons I'm pretty defensive when people speak out against Mike. But that was very important to me. And it was around this time that I had my first debate. And it happened in Hialeah, Florida, which is a suburb of Miami, in a Cuban church, Estrella de Belén Iglesia Bautista. And I debated a Harvard graduate who was a professor of world religions at Florida International University, Daniel Alvarez. That's on our YouTube channel. You can go watch it. And that was like in 2010. And that was just such an important moment for me. I had 2 days to prepare for that debate. Didn't know it was coming, and still did it. Now I want 8 months to prepare for a debate, but 2 days, and it went really well. And that gave me a level of confidence and a direction for my ministry and where I thought I was going in the future. It was also around this time that I looked at another doctrinal position, and that was the traditional view of hell. On this position, I realized that the conditionalist case for hell had gotten a lot better than I thought it was. It was a lot better than I thought it was, the biblical case for it. And good enough that when I preached, what I would say is, and if you heard me preach any time in the past 12 years, you heard me say this or present on this subject. Because I want to be clear on this is an important thing. And so what I've said is this. Look, here's what Jesus says in Mark chapter 9. That if you've got to cut off your hell, not to go to Gehenna, which is the word we translate for hell, like after the judgment hell. We use the word hell for that. If you got to cut off your arm, you cut off your arm. Gouge out your eye, gouge out your eye. Cut off your leg, cut off your leg. Because now he's speaking hyperbolically here, not literally. But the point was, it's better to go into heaven with one eye or go into the kingdom with one eye than to go into Gehenna with both eyes, where the worm doesn't die and the fire is not quenched. Okay, that's what the Bible says. No Christian can fault me for going to the words of Jesus. But when I present this, I say, now, is that talking about literal, unending flames? It could be. It might not be. But whatever you think it's saying, whether that's imagery or not, what's clear is that Jesus thought you shouldn't go to this place. And it's not good. And that's how I've always preached it. But I was rethinking that whole thing and considering it. And that led to, ultimately, a friendship with Chris Dates, who's the head of Rethinking Hell, and several other people. And that was very important to me. But you understand, I had been a Christian now and a pastor and an evangelist and an apologist, and was now, by this point, I was finishing up doctoral work and I was about to become maybe an associate professor at Trinity. And yet I was still tweaking my doctrine and refining it. And yet people think that, young earth creationism falls, so this is all bunk. I mean, you may not be one of these people that we call a fundamentalist atheist, who was a fundamentalist Christian, then became an atheist. Now you're a fundamentalist atheist who thinks that a wooden translation of everything in the Bible is all there is. But when you do that, you warrant the label, because that's what it is. So that was an important thing that happened about this time. At this time, I got into some other online debates. In fact, one of those debate with Will the Atheist and a follow-up debate / discussion with him is available on our YouTube channel and is available at trinityradio.org/debates. And so I was really beginning to enjoy that. And at this time, I developed a real worry, and that has to do with death. Gosh, If you've listened this long, we're about at the hour mark. I'm sorry and thank you. But it was at this point that I really became bothered by death. Now, you might wonder, and perhaps atheists would see this as a rallying cry, that, wait a minute, you are a Christian. Christians aren't supposed to fear death, right? You get heaven, you get paradise. Well, hold on a second. First things first. Number one, God has built into us survival instincts that are hard to work around and are there for a reason. And those things are still going to be there instinctually regardless. But on top of that, I was prepped for this in an interesting way. My father has a rare genetic blood disease called von Willebrand's. Now, there are a lot of people that have von Willebrand's. My father has an extremely rare form. They say he's stage 3, but that's only because my understanding is there's not a stage 4 category. But he has it worse. Mayo Clinic says he has it worse than anyone that has made it to his age. In other words, there are people around that have it as bad as he has, but they don't usually make it to his age. And there was a fear that when I was born that I would have my father's blood disease because it's genetic, and it gets worse with each generation. And if I had it, I would likely have died very young. In fact, the doctor said that my parents should abort. They went to another doctor, and that doctor said, if the child lives for 5 minutes, it'll be to the glory of God. And so they got churches praying, and they told God that if it be your will, this child grow up to be a minister of the gospel, then he's in your hands. Just save our child. And I was born without my father's blood disease, and my daughters don't have it. Now, I get that some of you don't buy prayer, and that's fine, but I'm telling you my story. And so, but because of my father's blood disease, throughout his life, I've always been told, I've been told by medical professionals, your dad's not going to live too much longer. Your dad's not going to live too much. You better appreciate your dad while you've got him. He's not going to live too much longer. I've been told that my whole life. So imagine growing up your whole life and thinking, this time next year, my dad could be dead because he could fall and scrape his knee or fall and get a tooth knocked out and bleed to death. Think about that. And so death was there. Now, it had nothing to do with Christianity or religion. Death was there very ominously, because even if Christianity is true, I don't want to lose my dad. One of the reasons it's okay for people to grieve and to be sad as Christians when their loved ones die is because, death, if I leave and on a trip and I'm not going to see my wife for a week, I'm sad. I'm not sad because I'm never going to see her again. Of course I think I'm going to see her again. I'm sad because I won't see her for a week. If my dad dies today, I won't see him for potentially decades. Now, I look forward to seeing him again, but I won't see him for potentially decades. So it's sad, okay? Grieving is a real thing. But death, when I got to my late 20s, getting close to 30, death really permeated my thinking. And so I decided, and I knew Christianity was true, but still, something about it is just, death was a problem. And now, not just my dad's death, but the recognition that I would die one day if the Lord does not return in my lifetime. And I have no guarantee that he will. And so I began to work on this and think about this. And I thought, I'm going to put down everything I can from within and without the Bible about death into one book. Actually, I didn't intentionally intend for it to be a book, but into one document so that I can hold it in my hand and say, I resolved this problem. And I did. I wrote the book, Death is a Doorway. And Dr. Pritchett says that's, for a long time, he said it was my best book, but then Letters from Ignorantia came out, and he says now Death is a Doorway is my second book, best book. And I can hold that book in my hand today and know I settled this issue for myself. And to this day, it's probably my second best-selling book after Core Facts, which is kind of my signature book, because Death is a Doorway, because everyone's going to die, right? It's something that relates to everyone. And so I really dealt with that and settled that. And now, to this, I'm older now than I was then by 10 years, but it's no big deal to me anymore, or at least not nearly like it was. I finished the doctorate, became something like an associate professor at Trinity. And I wrote the book, Evangelistic Apologetics. I turned my dissertation into apologetics, evangelistic apologetics, because what irritates me about apologetics is that mostly it's for, and if you've got a hobby apologetics channel out there, stop it. This is not, look, I can't tell you what to have a channel about, and there are a lot of things it's fine to have a hobby channel about. But what bothers me about Christian apologetics as it's received by people today is we are experiencing a golden age of apologetics, at least in terms of resources on offer in bookstores and online, but it's not often used for anything. You know, it's for me and people like me to sit around on the back row of church after church on Sunday and talk about some new argument we heard, some debate we saw, or some book we read. We don't use it for anything. And the most devout will go home after church is over and argue on the internet with people, Muslims, atheists, other Christians, whoever gets in the line of fire, and really feel like we've done the Lord's work. We're geek for apologetics like we're geeks for Star Wars and Lord of the Rings. We really feel like we've done the Lord's work when really you've just been a jerk. There are times to be bold, but here's the thing. Apologetics should be used for something. And why present a defense of the Christian faith, but that people might believe that the Christian faith is true? And principally that they might come to accept Christ. And so I wrote the book, Evangelistic Apologetics, to that end. For my DMin program at Luther Rice, I wrote a book that I did actual empirical research on churches, and that turned into, I don't have it as a book yet. If I ever do, it'll be discipleship apologetics. So you have evangelistic apologetics and discipleship apologetics. And so, well, it's longer than I thought it was, but I'm almost done. Stay with me. And so I want people to use it for something. And then this is where God's providence really becomes apparent in my life to me. The church where I had that debate with Daniel Alvarez wanted me to come back down and debate Calvinism. I'm not a Calvinist. I love my Calvinist brothers and sisters, and they are my brothers and sisters. And I don't really focus on Calvinism anymore. But at that time, I had really gotten into theological debates on this issue. I'd become a part of an organization in the Southern Baptist Convention called Connect 316, which was a group of concerned Southern Baptists who are non-Calvinists. And so I went back down there and I debated a guy who's been an adjunct professor for one of New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary's extension schools in Miami. And I debated Joe Myra on the issue of Calvinism. You can see that debate or hear that debate on our YouTube channel. I came back a couple of years later and debated, I went to Baltimore, Maryland and debated simultaneous to the Southern Baptist Convention. I debated Paul Cooper, who was a Calvinist. He's not a Calvinist now, and he's still a personal friend. And then later, Leighton Flowers and I connected. Some of you will know who Leighton Flowers is. He found out about me because he studied my debates with Joe Myra and Paul Cooper. I hope this is right, Leighton, because I was like the only Southern Baptist who was debating Calvinism at the time, I think. And so he and I partnered up and we debated Tyler Vela, he's a friend, I never know how to pronounce his name, and Sean Cole. And those debates are available on our YouTube channel. And then because of that relationship, he became a professor at Trinity and I became president somewhere in here at Trinity. And I began speaking at conferences that he helped to arrange for me with William Lane Craig and my friend Mike Licona and Lee Strobel and Mary Jo Sharp and all these incredible people. He took me on a trip to Israel. It was the third time I'd been to Israel, but I went on a trip with him to Israel for several days with Sean McDowell and Mark Middleberg and again, Craig, Mary Jo Sharp, all these people. And that was so cool. And I'll never forget standing in the Garden of Gethsemane with William Lane Craig talking about the new perspective on Paul. Just amazing. Just amazing memories. And I don't deserve it, but it was incredible. And then about this time, I really focused on the Bible in a new way. I felt like apologetics and all these kind of things, I needed to put that on hold because I had become fascinated with apologetics for years now, and I needed to get back to the Bible. And I studied the Bible with Steve Gregg, who's one of the greatest Bible teachers I've ever known. and went through the whole Bible with him pretty well in about 3 years' time. And then I really felt at that point, Lord, and I prayed in the room I'm in right now. I prayed and I said, Lord, I have been focusing on free will, libertarian free will, to debate Calvinists on this issue. But I really, at heart, am an evangelist. And I want to minister towards skeptics and atheists. And so if there's a way that I can use the knowledge that I gained from those years debating Calvinism to not let that go to waste, but to use that in debates and discussions with skeptics, I pray that you give it to me. And the answer came. And the answer was, one day I was thinking about William Lane Craig's moral argument, and I thought this could easily be augmented as an argument for libertarian freedom, and in the defense of the second premise, could give you everything that you want out of the moral argument anyway. So I put all that together. And I prayed and I said, Lord, I want to minister to as many people as I can in your name. And I want people to know about our school so that people can learn how to go all over the world and preach the gospel and do apologetics and counseling and all these kind of things. And so I said, I'm willing to do whatever it takes. And as I live and die, I can't convince anyone of this because it sounds really self-serving, but that's not the way I was thinking. And I said, Lord, if that means that I need a bigger platform, I pray you'd give it to me. And if the way to get there is scary or is stressful, I'll do it if that's what you want. A day or two after that, Leighton Flowers called me. Now remember, I wouldn't know Leighton if I hadn't debated Joe Myra and Paul Cooper, the Calvinists. I wouldn't have debated Joe Myra and Paul Cooper if I hadn't debated Daniel Alvarez at the church where I later debated Joe Myra. There's a string of related events that so represents, I think, the providence of God in my life. And Leighton Flowers called and said, hey, putting together the Unapologetics conference for next year, 2019, in February, wondering if you want to come and speak. And I'd done a bunch of those already. So yeah, I'll come. And he said, and I kind of want you to I want somebody to debate Matt Dillahunty. And would you be willing to do that? Well, I knew how good at rhetoric Matt Dillahunty is. And so I said, man, I don't know. I'm going to have to think about that. And he said, oh, no worry. I'm sure that Frank Turek or Mary Jo Sharp would be happy to do it in your stead. And I said, oh man, I just prayed about this 2 days ago, that God would give me an opportunity. I would take it, even if it seems stressful. And he said, and this is not deserved, but he said, you know what you are? I've seen you debate. You're like an Olympic swimmer, but you're scared. You're putting one toe in the water and, let me check with the other toe. You need someone like me just to come push you in the pool. And I said, you know something, I can't turn down this opportunity. And I took it. And as many of you know, I debated Matt Dillahunty. And in every one of the debates I'd had to that point, there had always been one or two things that I thought, man, I wish that had gone different, or I wish I'd said something else. But in that debate, it literally went as well as it could without Matt converting to Christianity right there on the stage. There's nothing about that debate at all that I wish went differently. And there's a lot that went well that I didn't plan for, and it just happened. And from there, I met Cameron Bertuzzi. Cameron contacted me, and we developed a friendship. I developed friendships through Cameron with John McCrae and Mike Winger. And ever since then, I've talked to those guys on almost a daily basis. And after the Matt Dillahunty debate, people began to flood to the channel. Flood. It's taken a while, but it had taken me 2 years to get to 1,000 subscribers at that point. And now, as of the making of this video, we're at like 11,500. So it took off. For me, it took off. And because of that, we've seen many, many people come to Christ. And after that, because of that, I had a platform through these response videos. I responded to Justin Brierley's debate with Rationality Rules. And so Justin Brierley reached out to me, and I got to go on Unbelievable and debate Dan Barker. And what was special about the debate with Dan Barker was that's the only person I've debated so far that had debated my heroes back when I was just getting into apologetics. And so that was cool. And again, I'm happy with how that debate went. There's really nothing about that debate that I'm not happy with. And the blessings just don't end. And I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but this is a story of a flawed human being who has made all kinds of mistakes and doesn't deserve what's been done. And yet God's done it. And so for those of you out there who think, who is this guy? Should I care what he has to say? Maybe not. But I think if you are a subscriber of this channel, you deserve to know who you're hearing from. And there you go. But at the end of the day, as I say all the time on this channel, I'm not an apologist first. I'm an evangelist. I am an Ephesians 4:11 evangelist. It is my heart's desire to see people that don't know my Jesus come to know him for the first time. And apologetics is just sometimes necessary. But that's the calling God has on my life. My most important credential is not that I'm a YouTuber or any degree that I have or where I've been or what I've done. My most important credential is that I'm a servant of the King. And I'm glad to be in his kingdom. I'll see you next time on Trinity Radio.